The winter of 1841 came early to the Appalachian Mountains. By late October, frost had already claimed the valleys of eastern Kentucky, creeping down from the peaks like skeletal fingers, reaching for whatever warmth remained. The leaves had fallen weeks ahead of schedule, leaving the hills naked and gray, exposed to winds that howled through the hollows with a sound that locals said resembled weeping. In these isolated regions, where civilization thinned to nothing more than scattered cabins and forgotten trails, winter didn't just arrive. It invaded, occupied, and ruled with an iron fist until spring dared to challenge its domain. This was frontier country, though few would call it that anymore. The great westward expansion had already pushed past these mountains, leaving behind only those too stubborn, too poor, or too damaged to follow. The people who remained were hardened by generations of survival in unforgiving terrain. They asked few questions, kept to themselves, and understood that in these mountains, a family's business was their own, no matter how strange it might seem to outsiders. The Pritchard family lived at the end of Blackwater Hollow, a narrow gorge so deep and shadowed that even at midday, sunlight barely reached the valley floor. Their property sat 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a rutted path that wound through dense forest and crossed 2 streams prone to flooding. In spring and summer, the journey was treacherous. In winter, it became nearly impossible. Silas Pritchard was 47 years old that autumn, though he looked a decade older. His face was weathered leather, creased with deep lines that mapped a life of unspoken hardships. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that could snap a fence post like kindling. His eyes were the color of slate, gray, cold, and impenetrable. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice emerged as a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, like distant thunder trapped inside a mountain. Silas had fought in the conflicts along the frontier in his youth, though he never spoke of what he'd seen or done. Some said he'd killed men. Others whispered darker things. What everyone agreed on was that something had broken inside Silas Pritchard during those years, something that never healed. He'd returned to these mountains changed, hollow, as if part of his soul had been left behind on some blood-soaked battlefield no one dared name. He'd married late, Judith Weaver, daughter of a preacher from the next county over. She'd been 22, plain-featured but strong, with dark hair she wore in a severe bun and eyes that never seemed to rest on anything for long. The marriage had been arranged, as many were in those parts, a transaction between families rather than a union of hearts. Within 2 years, Judith had given birth to their first daughter, Sarah. Then came Martha, then Elizabeth, then the twins, Rebecca and Rachel. 5 daughters, no sons. In a place where boys meant labor and continuity, this was seen as both a curse and a peculiarity. Silas accepted each birth with the same stone-faced silence, though neighbors noted that with each daughter, something in him seemed to recede further, like a man slowly disappearing into himself. By 1841, the Pritchard daughters ranged in age from 18 to 7. But here was the thing that made people whisper, that made traveling peddlers and occasional visitors exchange glances weighted with unspoken questions. No one had seen the Pritchard daughters in years. Not at church services in the small chapel 10 miles away. Not at the annual harvest gathering. Not even at the trading post where mountain families came to barter goods and hear news from the wider world. The girls had simply vanished from public life, as completely as if they'd never existed. When asked, Silas offered only curt explanations. They were sickly, prone to fits, not fit for company. Judith, on the rare occasions she appeared in town, would nod in agreement, her eyes fixed on the ground, her movements nervous and bird-like. She bought supplies quickly and left without engaging in the casual conversation that usually accompanied such errands. People noticed bruises on her wrists, shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and a tremor in her hands that hadn't been there in her youth. The Pritchard property itself seemed to reject visitors. The main house was a 2-story structure built from rough-hewn logs, its windows small and deep-set like suspicious eyes. Grey smoke rose perpetually from the chimney, but the house itself emanated no sense of warmth or welcome. Behind it stood a massive barn, larger than the house itself, constructed from dark wood that had weathered to the color of old blood. The barn doors were always closed, secured with heavy chains and padlocks that seemed excessive for simple livestock. Around the property, Silas had erected fencing, not the typical split-rail fences common to mountain farms, but tall wooden barriers that blocked sight lines and created a maze of enclosed spaces. It was as if the entire property had been designed not to keep animals in, but to keep the world out. The first real sign that something was deeply wrong came in early November. Samuel Webb, a trapper who ran lines through the mountains, had been tracking a wounded elk through the forests above Blackwater Hollow. The blood trail led him closer to the Pritchard property than he'd intended to venture. It was dusk, that uncertain hour when daylight surrenders to darkness and the forest seems to hold its breath. Samuel was about to turn back when he heard it, a sound that froze him in place. Singing, multiple voices, female voices, rising from somewhere beyond the tree line. But this wasn't the joyful singing of a family gathered around a hearth. These voices were thin, reedy, desperate, like the cries of birds trapped in a cage. The melody was recognizable, an old hymn Samuel's own mother had sung when he was a child, but the words seemed wrong, twisted, as if the singers had forgotten how the song was supposed to go and were trying to remember through sheer will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the singing stopped, cut off mid-verse, as if a hand had been clamped over multiple mouths simultaneously. What followed was worse than the singing, silence so absolute that Samuel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, cutting through that silence, came the sound of chains, the distinctive metallic rattle of heavy iron links being dragged across wood. Samuel Webb had spent 30 years in these mountains. He'd faced bears, mountain lions, and winter storms that could kill a man in hours. He wasn't easily frightened. But something about those sounds, the aborted singing, the chains, the suffocating silence that followed, sent a primal terror through him. He ran. By the time he reached the settlement, night had fallen completely. In the wavering light of oil lamps at the trading post, Samuel told his story to the handful of men gathered there. His hands shook as he spoke, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. The reaction was divided. Some dismissed it. Mountain winds played tricks, created sounds that weren't really there. Perhaps he'd heard foxes or owls or the creak of old trees. Others exchanged knowing looks, the kind that spoke of suspicions long held but never voiced. The Pritchard place had always been wrong, they said. Always. But what could be done? In these mountains, a man's home was his kingdom, his family, his subjects. The law, such as it existed, came from a circuit judge who visited twice a year and county sheriffs whose jurisdiction was more theoretical than practical. Besides, Silas Pritchard was not a man to be confronted lightly. And without proof of actual wrongdoing, what authority would dare intrude on a family's private affairs? Still, Samuel's story spread. Within days, everyone in the surrounding settlements had heard about the singing, the chains, the silence. Theories multiplied like weeds. Some said the daughters were mad, locked away for everyone's safety. Others whispered about devil worship, dark rituals performed in that oversized barn. A few suggested something even worse, that perhaps the daughters were no longer alive at all, that what Samuel had heard were not earthly voices, but the echoes of souls trapped between this world and the next. What no one knew, what they couldn't know, was the truth. Behind those barn doors, in a structure that should have housed livestock and hay, the 5 Pritchard daughters lived in conditions that would haunt anyone who witnessed them. But the full horror of their situation would take time to unravel. Layers of suffering and systematic cruelty that had accumulated over years, hidden from the world by distance, isolation, and the mountain code of silence. As November deepened, and the first snows began to fall, Blackwater Hollow grew quieter still. The Pritchard property disappeared behind a veil of white, smoke from their chimney the only sign that anyone lived there at all. But at night, if you listened carefully, if you dared to venture close enough to that property where the wind carried sounds down from the hollow, you might hear it again. That singing, those chains, that terrible silence. And you would wonder, as Samuel Webb wondered, as the whole settlement was beginning to wonder, what exactly was happening in that barn? What had Silas Pritchard done to his daughters? And how long had it been going on? The winter of 1841 would provide no answers, not yet. But it would mark the beginning of questions that would eventually demand to be answered, no matter how dark the truth might be. Winter tightened its grip on Blackwater Hollow. By mid-November, snow had accumulated to depths that made travel nearly impossible. The path to the Pritchard property became impassable, a white corridor between walls of dark trees where silence reigned absolute. Most families in these mountains used winter as a time of rest, of huddling around fires and surviving until spring. But for those who'd heard Samuel Webb's story, winter brought no peace, only questions that festered in the darkness. Inside the settlement's trading post, where men gathered to escape the cold and share what little news existed in these isolated parts, the Pritchard family had become the primary topic of conversation. Every man present had an opinion, a theory, a half-remembered detail that seemed suddenly significant. Thomas Aldrich, the settlement's informal leader, finally spoke what others had been thinking. "Someone needs to check on them," he said, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations. Thomas was 53, with a thick grey beard and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "Whatever's happening up there, Christian duty demands we at least ensure the family hasn't frozen to death." It was a reasonable excuse, one that provided moral cover for what everyone really wanted: answers. The question was, who would go? Silas Pritchard wasn't known for welcoming visitors, and the journey itself was dangerous in these conditions. After considerable debate, they settled on Reverend Josiah Matthews, a circuit preacher who'd recently arrived in the area. As a man of God, he had an excuse to visit any family, regardless of their reputation for privacy. And as a newcomer, he didn't carry the weight of years of avoided confrontations and unspoken suspicions. Reverend Matthews was 32 years old, lean and angular, with the intense eyes of a true believer. He'd come to these mountains with a mission to bring salvation to the scattered souls who'd been forgotten by the established churches of more civilized regions. He carried a worn Bible, rode an aging mare named Grace, and possessed the kind of unwavering faith that could interpret any situation as part of God's mysterious plan. When Thomas Aldrich approached him with the request, Reverend Matthews agreed immediately. He saw it as his duty, an opportunity to minister to a family that had clearly isolated itself from the community of faith. He had no idea what he was about to encounter. The Reverend set out on a grey morning, when the sky hung low and heavy, threatening more snow. The temperature had risen slightly, just enough to make the existing snow sticky and treacherous. His mare struggled through drifts that reached past her knees, her breath coming in great clouds of steam. The journey that should have taken 2 hours stretched to 4. When Reverend Matthews finally emerged from the tree line and saw the Pritchard property, something in his chest tightened. Even blanketed in snow, the place radiated wrongness. The house stood dark against the white landscape, its windows like empty eye sockets in a skull. The massive barn loomed behind it, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. But what struck Matthews most was the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but an oppressive absence of sound that seemed to absorb even the soft crunch of his horse's hooves in the snow. No smoke rose from the chimney. No tracks marked the snow around the buildings. It was as if the property had been abandoned, left to the mercy of winter. Matthews dismounted and approached the house, his boots sinking deep with each step. He knocked on the door, 3 solid raps that echoed in the stillness. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, calling out, "Hello! Reverend Matthews here. I've come to check on your family's welfare." Still nothing. He was about to knock a third time when the door suddenly jerked open, revealing a slice of darkness within. Silas Pritchard filled the doorway like a wall of stone. "We don't need a preacher," Silas said, his voice flat and final. Matthews had prepared for resistance. He offered his warmest smile. "Brother Pritchard, I'm not here to impose. The settlement was concerned given the harsh weather. I wanted to ensure your family was managing well, that you had sufficient supplies. We're fine. And your daughters? Your wife? Are they well?" Something flickered in Silas's eyes. Anger, perhaps, or fear. It passed too quickly to identify. "They're fine. Now leave." But Matthews had caught a glimpse past Silas's shoulder, into the dimness of the house. What he saw made his prepared speeches dissolve on his tongue. The interior was sparse to the point of emptiness. No furniture visible, no signs of comfort or habitation. And there, standing in the shadows at the base of a staircase, was a woman he assumed must be Judith Pritchard. She looked like a ghost. Thin to the point of emaciation, her dress hanging from her frame like a shroud, Judith stared at Matthews with eyes that contained something beyond fear, something like desperate, silent pleading. Her hands were clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and she was shaking, though whether from cold or emotion, Matthews couldn't tell. "Mrs. Pritchard," Matthews called past Silas. "Are you well? Do you need anything?" Judith's mouth opened, but before she could speak, Silas shifted his massive frame, blocking Matthews's view entirely. "My wife is ill. She doesn't speak with strangers. You need to go. Now." There was no mistaking the threat in Silas's tone. Matthews was not a coward, but he was also not a fool. Silas Pritchard was half a foot taller and outweighed him by at least 80 pounds. And they were alone, miles from any help, in conditions that could kill a man caught unprepared. "Of course," Matthews said, taking a step back. "But Brother Pritchard, I must ask, your daughters, I've heard they're unwell. Perhaps I could offer prayer, or—" "They're not here." The lie was so obvious, so blatant, that Matthews felt his face flush. "Not here? Where?" "Gone. Sent away. Family matter. None of your concern." Each sentence came out like a hammer blow. Silas began to close the door. "Mr. Pritchard, The door slammed shut. Matthews heard the heavy sound of a bar being lowered into place, locks being turned. He stood in the snow, staring at the closed door, his mind racing. The daughters were sent away? When? How? The path he'd just traveled was nearly impassable now, and it had been worse for weeks. No one could have made the journey with 5 girls, especially in these conditions. And if they'd left before the worst of the winter, surely someone in the settlement would have seen them pass through. Matthews walked back to his horse slowly, his instincts screaming that something was profoundly wrong. As he mounted Grace and prepared to leave, he glanced at the barn. And that's when he saw it. A face, pale and thin, pressed against a gap in the barn's wooden siding. It was there for only a second before vanishing, but Matthews's blood ran cold. A girl, one of the daughters, watching him from inside the barn. He urged his horse forward, past the house, angling to get a better view of the barn. But before he'd covered 20 yards, the front door of the house burst open and Silas emerged, moving with frightening speed for a man his size. "I said leave." Silas's roar echoed across the property. In his hand he carried a rifle, old but well-maintained, and pointed directly at Matthews. The Reverend didn't need further encouragement. He turned Grace and headed back toward the trail, his heart hammering. But even as he rode away, even as the Pritchard property disappeared behind the trees, he couldn't shake what he'd seen. Judith's haunted eyes, the empty house, Silas's barely contained violence, and that face, that thin, pale face pressed against the barn wall, watching, silent, trapped. By the time Matthews reached the settlement, dusk was falling and snow had begun again. He went directly to the trading post, where Thomas Aldrich and several other men were waiting. In the warm glow of lantern light, Matthews told them everything. The encounter with Silas, the glimpse of Judith, the obvious lies, and most importantly, the face he'd seen in the barn. "The daughters are there," Matthews said, his voice shaking slightly. "In that barn. I saw one of them. And Silas lied about them being sent away. Whatever's happening, it's happening in that barn." The men exchanged dark looks. Samuel Webb, who'd been listening from a corner, spoke up. "The singing, the chains, Jesus Christ, what's he doing to them?" "We need to go back," Matthews said firmly. "With enough men, with authority." "Authority?" Thomas Aldrich shook his head. "Nearest sheriff is 40 miles away, and he won't come up here in winter on the word of a new preacher and a trapper. You know how it is in these parts, Reverend. A man's family is his own business. Even if he's harming them? Even then," Aldrich interrupted. "Unless we have proof, unless someone dies or escapes and tells us what's happening, there's nothing we can do. Not legally." Silence fell over the room, heavy with frustration and helplessness. They all knew Aldrich was right. The mountains made their own laws, and those laws favored isolation and privacy above all else. Interfering in family matters could spark feuds that lasted generations, could lead to violence that authorities couldn't or wouldn't stop. But Matthews couldn't let it go. Over the next weeks, as winter deepened and travel became truly impossible, he asked questions, gathered information, pieced together a history of the Pritchard family that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The daughters had been normal once, by all accounts. Sarah, the eldest, had been seen in town as a child, quiet but bright-eyed. The others had been glimpsed occasionally in their early years. But gradually, over the span of 5 or 6 years, they'd vanished from public view. And with each passing year, Judith Pritchard had become more withdrawn, more frightened, more like a prisoner than a wife. Old Mrs. Fletcher, who'd lived in these mountains for 70 years, remembered something else. "Silas's father," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He was wrong in the head. Kept his wife locked up, wouldn't let her leave the house. Claimed she was sick, but everyone knew he beat her. She died young under questionable circumstances. Some things run in families, Reverend. Some darkness gets passed down." As December arrived and the mountains became a frozen wasteland, Reverend Matthews made a decision. When spring came, when the paths cleared and travel became possible again, he would return to the Pritchard property. Not alone and not unarmed. Whatever was happening in that barn, it would be brought to light. He swore it on his Bible, on his soul. But spring was months away, and in the barn at the end of Blackwater Hollow, in the cold and the darkness, the Pritchard daughters waited, chained, silent, and utterly alone with their father's madness. The singing Samuel had heard, the face Matthews had glimpsed, these were just shadows of a horror that had been unfolding for years, hidden by distance, isolation, and the mountain's code of silence. A horror that, come spring, would finally be revealed in all its terrible completeness. Winter held Blackwater Hollow in its grip, but winter couldn't last forever. March 1842 arrived with the first tentative promises of spring. The snow began to melt in earnest, transforming the mountains into a landscape of rushing water and treacherous mud. Ice broke apart in the streams with sounds like rifle shots, and the forests came alive with the drip and trickle of winter releasing its hold. But the thaw brought more than water. It brought revelation. On a cold morning when fog still clung to the valleys, a figure appeared on the trail leading from Blackwater Hollow. She moved slowly, erratically, like a person who'd forgotten how to walk. Her feet were bare and bleeding, her dress torn and filthy, and she collapsed twice before reaching the first cabin on the settlement's outskirts. It was Sarah Pritchard, the eldest daughter, and she was running for her life. Mrs. Eleanor Grant, a widow who lived alone with her 2 sons, was drawing water from her well when she heard the sound, a low, animal-like moan that made her blood run cold. She turned to see the girl stumbling into her yard, one hand outstretched, the other clutching her stomach. Sarah's face was hollow, her eyes wild and unfocused, and around her wrists were deep, infected wounds that could only have been made by one thing: shackles. "Help," Sarah whispered, the word barely audible. "Please, help." Then she fell forward into the mud and didn't move. Eleanor's sons carried Sarah inside and laid her by the fire. As Eleanor cleaned the girl's wounds and tried to get her warm, she felt a horror growing in her chest. Sarah's body told a story of systematic abuse that defied comprehension. She was severely malnourished, her ribs visible through translucent skin. Her wrists and ankles bore the marks of prolonged restraint, layers of scars suggesting years of being chained. There were other marks too, bruises in various stages of healing, and signs of injuries that had never been properly treated. But worst of all were Sarah's eyes. Even unconscious, they moved behind her lids in patterns that suggested nightmares from which there was no waking. And when she briefly regained consciousness, she would scream. Wordless, primal screams that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than physical pain. Within hours, word had spread through the settlement. Reverend Matthews arrived first, his face grim. Thomas Aldrich followed with several other men. They gathered in Eleanor's small cabin, staring at the broken girl by the fire, and felt the weight of their own complicity. They'd suspected, they'd questioned, but they'd done nothing, and this was the result. "We need to hear what happened," Aldrich said finally. "When she can speak, we need to know everything." It took 2 days before Sarah could form coherent words. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse from screaming, barely above a whisper. What she told them turned speculation into nightmare, suspicion into certainty. "The barn," Sarah began, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "He keeps us in the barn, me, Martha, Elizabeth, Rebecca, Rachel. We've been there for years, chained, in the dark." The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. "How long?" Matthews asked gently. "I don't know anymore. Years, many years. I was 12, I think, when it started. I'm 18 now, or 19. I've lost count of the winters." She described a horror that seemed impossible, yet the evidence lay before them in her scarred flesh. Silas had begun isolating the daughters gradually, telling neighbors they were ill, prone to fits, dangerous to themselves and others. At first, they'd been locked in their rooms, but as they grew older, as they asked questions and tried to leave, Silas's methods had become more severe. The barn had been converted into a prison. Individual stalls, each containing a daughter, each secured with chains that allowed minimal movement. Food came once a day, sometimes. Water was rationed. In winter, there was no heat. In summer, the barn became an oven. And Silas visited them regularly, not with fatherly concern, but with rage and paranoia that grew worse each year. "He said the world was evil," Sarah continued, tears now streaming down her face. "That we were corrupted, that women were agents of sin. He said he was protecting us, purifying us, keeping us from the devil's influence. But it wasn't protection. It was torture." "And your mother?" Matthews asked. "Judith?" Sarah's face twisted with something between pity and anger. "She's terrified of him. He beats her if she helps us. At first, she would sneak us food, blankets. But he caught her. After that, she stopped trying. I think part of her broke. She became like a ghost in her own house." The men listening struggled to process what they were hearing. This wasn't a story from some distant barbaric land. This was happening here, in their mountains, while they'd gone about their lives. "How did you escape?" Aldrich asked. "The thaw," Sarah said simply. "The lock on my chain, it was old, rusty. The moisture from the melting snow made it weak. I worked at it for 3 days, scraping, pulling. My wrists..." She looked down at the bandaged wounds. I tore them open, but I got free. I waited until night, until Father was asleep. Then I broke out through a weak board in the barn wall. And your sisters? The question came from Matthews, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Sarah's expression became anguished. Still there, still chained. I wanted to free them, but I couldn't. The keys. Father keeps them on him always. And I was so weak, so scared he'd wake up. I thought if I escaped, if I got help, we could save them. But now we act, Aldrich said firmly, standing. We gather every able man in this settlement, and we go to that property. We bring those girls home, and we bring Silas Pritchard to justice. The men nodded in agreement, but Matthews saw the complexity beneath their determination. Justice here was a fluid concept. The nearest lawman was distant, and mountain justice often meant something darker than courts and trials. That night, 15 men gathered at the trading post. They carried rifles, axes, rope. Some came for righteousness, others for revenge against a man who'd violated the most basic laws of humanity. Reverend Matthews insisted on coming too, though he carried no weapon. Someone needed to think of the girls, of their souls and sanity after years of unimaginable abuse. They left at first light, a grim procession moving through the muddy trails toward Blackwater Hollow. Sarah had begged to come too, but Eleanor Grant held her back. The girl had been through enough. What came next would be ugly, and there was no need for her to witness it. The journey took half the day. The path was treacherous with mud and runoff, but determination drove them forward. As they neared the Pritchard property, they spread out, surrounding it from multiple angles. They weren't taking chances. If Silas tried to run or mount a defense, they'd be ready. Thomas Aldrich, flanked by 4 armed men, approached the front door. Behind the house, others moved toward the barn. The plan was simple: secure Silas first, then free the daughters. Aldrich didn't bother knocking. He tried the door, unlocked, and pushed it open. "Silas Pritchard," he called out, "come out peacefully. We know what you've done." Silence. The men entered the house cautiously, rifles raised. The interior was even more disturbing in daylight, empty, cold, no signs of normal family life. Upstairs they found Judith cowering in a corner of a bedroom, her eyes wide with terror. She wouldn't speak, couldn't speak, just shook her head violently when they tried to question her. But Silas wasn't in the house, which meant a shout from outside. "The barn! He's in the barn!" Aldrich and his men ran toward the massive structure. The barn doors stood open now, and Silas Pritchard stood in the opening, rifle in hand. But he wasn't pointing it at the approaching men. He was pointing it inward, into the darkness of the barn. "Stay back!" Silas roared, his voice cracked and wild. "This is my family, my daughters. You have no right." "Silas!" Matthews called out, stepping forward despite the danger. "It's over. Sarah escaped. She told us everything. Put down the weapon and let those girls go." Silas's face contorted with rage and something else. Fear, perhaps, or madness fully realized. "Sarah was always weak, disobedient. She deserved worse than what I gave her. They all deserve it. Corrupted, sinful creatures pretending to be innocent. I was trying to save them, to burn the sin out of them." From inside the barn came sounds that made Matthews's stomach turn. Whimpers, the rattle of chains, voices that might have been human, but sounded more like wounded animals. "Let us help them," Matthews pleaded. "Whatever you think they've done, whatever your reasons, they need help. They're your daughters, Silas, your own flesh and blood." But something had broken in Silas Pritchard long ago. Perhaps in those frontier battles he never spoke of. Perhaps from his father's example. Perhaps from some darkness that was simply born into his bones. Whatever the source, he'd descended into a madness that wrapped itself in righteousness, that called torture salvation and cruelty love. "If I can't save them," Silas said, his voice suddenly calm in a way that was more terrifying than his rage, "then no one can." He turned the rifle toward the interior of the barn, and in that frozen moment, as 15 men realized what he intended, a gunshot split the air. But it wasn't Silas who fired. One of the settlers, a man named Jacob Weiss, who'd lost his own daughter to illness years before, had circled around to the side of the barn. Seeing what was about to happen, he'd shot through a gap in the boards, not at Silas's center mass, but at his shoulder. Silas dropped the rifle with a howl of pain and rage. Before he could recover, men were on him, dragging him to the ground, binding his hands with rope while he cursed and struggled. And finally, after years of silence, the barn doors stood open and light flooded in. What the men saw inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 4 girls, Martha, Elizabeth, and the twins Rebecca and Rachel, chained in individual stalls, living in conditions no animal should endure. The smell alone nearly drove them back outside. And the girls themselves, thin as skeletons, covered in filth and sores, with eyes that reflected years of suffering that no human should have to bear. Reverend Matthews fell to his knees and wept. The next hours were a blur of horror and mercy intertwined. The men broke the chains, binding the 4 remaining Pritchard daughters, using axes and hammers when keys couldn't be found fast enough. Each girl was carried carefully from the barn, wrapped in blankets brought from the settlement, and laid in the back of wagons for the journey back to civilization. None of them could walk. Years of confinement had atrophied their muscles to the point where standing was nearly impossible. Martha, the second eldest at 17, tried to speak, but her voice was a broken rasp. She'd screamed herself hoarse long ago, and her vocal cords had never properly healed. 15-year-old Elizabeth stared straight ahead with empty eyes, unresponsive even when touched gently. The twins, Rebecca and Rachel, only 13 years old, clung to each other and whimpered at every sound, every movement, every beam of sunlight that touched their pale skin. They were alive, but barely human anymore. Thomas Aldrich stood in the barn after the girls had been removed, looking at what Silas had created. Each stall contained a thin pile of rotted straw, a bucket that served purposes too vile to contemplate, and bolts drilled into the wooden walls where chains had been secured. On one wall, scratched into the wood with something sharp, perhaps a nail, perhaps a fingernail, were marks. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Marks that might have been counting days or prayers or simply the physical manifestation of slowly fracturing sanity. "How long?" Aldrich asked aloud, though no one was there to answer. "How long has this been happening?" Based on Sarah's testimony and the physical evidence, they could piece together a timeline that stretched back at least 6 years, years in which the girls had been systematically imprisoned, abused, and broken by the man who should have protected them most. Outside, Silas Pritchard sat bound to a tree, blood seeping through the bandage someone had tied around his wounded shoulder. He was no longer raging or struggling. Instead, he'd retreated into himself, muttering under his breath. Fragments of scripture twisted into justifications, paranoid delusions about corruption and sin, disconnected ramblings that suggested a mind completely severed from reality. Reverend Matthews approached him cautiously. Why? It was the only question that mattered. "Why would you do this to your own daughters?" Silas looked up, and for a moment his eyes seemed almost lucid. "To save them," he said simply. "The world is poison. Men are beasts. I saw it in the frontier, what men do, what they take, how they corrupt. My daughters were pure. I was keeping them pure. By chaining them in a barn? By starving them? By—" Matthews couldn't continue. The enormity of the delusion was too vast to argue with. "They needed to be cleansed," Silas continued, his voice taking on the cadence of sermon. "The sins of Eve live in all women. I was burning it out, purifying them through suffering, the way Christ was purified on the cross. I was saving their souls from damnation." "You were torturing them," Matthews said flatly. "You were destroying them. There's no scripture that justifies what you did, no God that would ask for this." But Silas just smiled, a horrible, vacant smile. You don't understand. You can't understand. This was love. I loved them so much I couldn't let them be corrupted. Matthews turned away, sickened. There would be no reasoning with Silas Pritchard, no moment of recognition or redemption. Whatever had been human in him had been consumed by the darkness that festered in his mind. He'd tortured his daughters in the name of love, committed atrocities in the name of God, and would die believing he'd been righteous. The settlement reached by evening. Word had spread, and the entire community gathered to witness the return. Women wept openly at the sight of the Pritchard daughters, their condition speaking louder than any words could. Eleanor Grant's cabin became a makeshift hospital, with every woman in the settlement contributing blankets, food, medicine, whatever could be spared. Dr. Hendricks, who traveled the circuit providing medical care to remote communities, arrived 3 days later. His examination of the 5 girls confirmed what everyone already knew but couldn't quite believe. Years of systematic abuse, malnutrition to the point of near starvation, infected wounds from prolonged restraint, and psychological damage that might never fully heal. The twins, Dr. Hendricks told the gathered men privately, may never speak again. The trauma has been too severe, too prolonged. And Elizabeth, her mind has retreated somewhere we can't reach. She may never come back. But there were small mercies too. Sarah, despite everything, retained a spark of resilience. Day by day she grew stronger, both physically and mentally. She began helping care for her sisters, speaking to them softly, holding their hands, being the bridge between their imprisonment and whatever freedom might be possible. Martha, though damaged, could still smile, a weak, trembling thing, but a smile nonetheless. When given paper and pencil, she wrote in shaking letters, "Thank you." We thought no one would come. The community rallied around them with an outpouring of support that spoke to the deep shame they all felt for not acting sooner. Families offered to take the girls in, to provide homes and care. Donations of food, clothing, and money appeared daily. It was as if the entire settlement was trying to atone for years of willful blindness. As for Silas Pritchard, justice came swiftly, if not legally. The circuit judge wasn't due for 3 months, and the nearest sheriff was still weeks away by message. The men of the settlement faced a choice: wait for official justice, which might take months and might not be severe enough, or enact their own. They chose the latter. This was frontier justice, mountain law, and Silas had violated the most fundamental codes of their society. A trial was held in the trading post, with Thomas Aldrich presiding. Witnesses testified. Sarah most powerfully, though her sisters couldn't speak. The physical evidence from the barn was presented, and Silas was given a chance to defend himself. He ranted about divine mission, about purification, about the corruption of women, and the need for harsh discipline. He showed no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing. If anything, he seemed proud of what he'd done. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentence was immediate, hanging, to be carried out at dawn the next day. Reverend Matthews objected, citing the need for proper legal proceedings, for mercy even in the face of monstrous acts. But he was overruled. The mountains made their own justice, and that justice was final. That night, Matthews visited Silas in the locked shed where he was being held. He brought his Bible, hoping even now for some sign of humanity, some spark of remorse that might save the man's soul. "Do you repent?" Matthews asked. "Do you see what you've done?" Silas looked at him with perfect calm. "I regret nothing. I would do it again. I was right, Reverend. The world will prove me right. Women need to be controlled, dominated, kept pure by force if necessary. I was just ahead of my time." Matthews left without another word. At dawn, as the sun broke over the mountain peaks, Silas Pritchard was led to a tree at the edge of the settlement. A rope was prepared, a horse readied. The entire community gathered to witness, though the Pritchard daughters were kept away. They'd seen enough of their father. As the noose was placed around his neck, Silas was given a chance for final words. He looked at the assembled crowd and spoke clearly. "I die a martyr to righteousness. God knows my heart. God knows I was right." Then the horse was struck, and Silas Pritchard dangled from the tree until he was dead. There were no tears shed for him. No prayers offered beyond the perfunctory. He was buried in an unmarked grave far from consecrated ground, and his name became a curse in the settlement, a warning of what madness and cruelty could do when left unchecked. But the story didn't end with Silas's death. Judith Pritchard, who'd been found cowering in her bedroom that day of the rescue, never recovered. She died 3 months later, simply refusing to eat or speak, wasting away until her heart stopped. Some said it was guilt that killed her, the knowledge that she'd failed to protect her daughters, that her weakness had enabled their suffering. Others said she'd died of a broken mind, shattered by years of abuse from a husband she'd never had the strength to oppose. The 5 daughters survived, though survival meant different things for each of them. Sarah, the strongest, eventually married a young farmer from a neighboring county. She bore 3 children and lived to old age, though she never spoke publicly about her years in the barn. Those who knew her said she sometimes woke screaming in the night, even decades later. Martha found work as a seamstress, living quietly in a small town where no one knew her history. She never married, never had children, but she found a kind of peace in solitude and routine. Elizabeth never fully recovered her mind. She lived in the care of a kindly widow until her death at 32, childlike and gentle, forever trapped in whatever place her psyche had retreated to for protection. The twins, Rebecca and Rachel, remained inseparable until the end. They never learned to speak again, communicating only through gestures and looks that only they understood. They lived together in a small cabin provided by the community, farming a small plot of land, aging into old women who were seen as strange but harmless. They died within days of each other at 61 and were buried side by side. The barn itself was burned the week after Silas's hanging. The entire settlement gathered to watch it go up in flames, a cleansing fire that consumed the site of so much suffering. The ashes were scattered, and no one ever built on that land again. Even today, locals say the ground where the barn stood remains barren, as if the earth itself rejects the memory of what happened there. The story of the Pritchard family became legend in those mountains. It was told around fires, whispered to children as a cautionary tale, recorded in sparse entries in church ledgers and county records. Over time, details were forgotten or embellished, but the core remained. A father's madness, daughters imprisoned and tortured, a community's shame at not acting sooner. And in the retelling, questions lingered. How had no one known? How had it gone on so long? What darkness lived in Silas Pritchard that could transform love into torture, protection into imprisonment? Were there signs missed, warnings ignored, cries for help that went unheard? The truth, uncomfortable as it was, lay in the isolation of mountain life, in the unwritten law that a man's family was his own business, in the willingness of a community to look away rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Silas Pritchard was a monster, yes, but he was a monster enabled by silence, by distance, by the mountains themselves, which kept secrets as well as they kept out intruders. In the end, 5 girls survived years of unimaginable horror. They bore scars, physical and psychological, that never fully healed, but they survived. And in surviving, they testified to both the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. The barn is gone. Silas is dust in an unmarked grave. But the story remains, a dark chapter in Appalachian history, a reminder of what can happen when evil is allowed to flourish in isolation, when community fails to protect its most vulnerable, when the simple act of asking questions is deferred in favor of comfortable ignorance. Blackwater Hollow is still there, deep in the Kentucky mountains. The house collapsed decades ago, reclaimed by forest. But on certain nights, locals claim you can still hear something on the wind. Sounds like singing, like chains rattling, like the ghosts of girls who suffered alone in the dark, waiting for a rescue that came too late. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the land should remember. Perhaps we all should remember what happened in 1841, in that barn at the end of a forgotten hollow, where a father's madness imprisoned his daughters, and a community's silence allowed evil to thrive. This is their story, this is their testimony, and this is a truth that should never be forgotten. The end.